Tucker Carlson just dropped a bombshell interview with the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugan. Dugan has been called the most dangerous philosopher in the world, but dangerous to whom? Well, we're about to find out. You're not going to want to miss this. Hey gang, it's me, Dr. Steve, your patron professor, here to help you stay sane in these insane times. So make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button. Also, as many of you know, we have just unveiled our brand new Turley Talks app, our very own platform that can never, ever be canceled. It's a beautiful personal app that you can download completely free simply by clicking on the link below or going to fight.turleytalks.com. This app is our way to declare our independence from all woke platforms that hate us and to tell the international woke police precisely where they can stick it. You're going to love it. Click on that link below or go to fight.turleytalks.com right now. Tucker began the interview by asking Dugan why he thought that the whole of the Western world seems to be at war with itself. Why is it that particularly the United States and Canada and Australia and Western Europe, why do so many in these nations seem to loathe Western civilization? Dugan's answer is profound. Take a look.
So individual, it was the key and is still key concept that was put in the center of liberal ideology. And liberalism, as in my reading, it is a kind of historical and cultural and political and philosophical process of liberation of individual of any kind of collective identity, collective or that transcends individual. And that started with refuse of Catholic Church as collective identity, of empire, Western Empire as collective identity. After that, it was a revolt against a national state as collective identity in favor of purely civil society. After that, there was a big fight of the 20th century between liberalism, communism, and fascism. And liberalism has won once more.
Yes.
So, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was only liberalism. And Francis Fukuyama has pointed out correctly that there are no more any ideologies except of liberalism. And liberalism, that was liberation of this individual from any kind of collective identity. There were only two collective identities to liberate from. Gender identity, because it is collective identity. You are man or woman collectively, so you could not be alone. So liberation from gender, and that has led to transgenders, to LGBT, and new form of sexual individualism. So sex is something optional. And that was not just deviation of liberalism. That was necessarily elements of implementation and the victory of this liberal ideology. And the last step that is not yet totally made is liberation from human identity, humanity optional.
The last step is liberation from humanity. And that's absolutely key to understanding what's happening in the West. As you heard, Dugan locates the source of Western decline in the rise of liberalism, which is the philosophical and political enterprise involving the liberation of the individual from any form of collective identity and constraint. Interestingly, Dugan roots liberalism in the medieval philosophical movement of the 14th century known as nominalism. And what made nominalists unique is they rejected the notion that there was any relationship between physical things and heavenly transcendent ideas. Only things, particular things in this world exist, and they don't have any other transcendent relationship to anything above them. And so nominalism created the notion of the radical sovereign individual, and that formed the basis of the political and philosophical project of liberating the individual from all forms of collective identity and constraint. And what makes Dugan's analysis so profound is that he recognizes that the logical outworking of this involves liberation from humanity itself, because humanity is the ultimate form of collective identity. It's not just liberating the individual from tradition and nation and gender and the like. No, ultimately, the individual is constrained by collective human identity. And so this is why liberalism ultimately leads to what's called posthumanism or post-humanity, where we in effect use technology to transcend beyond the human. And this is absolutely key. If Western civilization was ultimately about awakening our true humanity, then liberals will ultimately be at war with Western civilization precisely because they are at war with the very humanity it seeks to awaken. It's a very, very profound thesis, and that's just par for the course in Dugan's thinking. But of course, as Tucker pointed out, you can't access Dugan's thinking because the Biden administration is actively censoring Dugan. In fact, with the current climate of the media industry, navigating the sea of bias and misinformation is absolutely exhausting. Staying informed on the many perspectives is quite valuable, but it's getting harder and harder. And that's why I rely on our sponsor, Ground News, to streamline my research. Ground News is available as a website and an app, and instead of sifting through multiple sources myself, trying to see every angle of a particular news story, Ground News does it all for me. On top of that, Ground News gives valuable insight into each publication's credibility and which way they lean politically. So let me show you how it works. It's really neat. Take this article on Trump's lead over Biden in 6 of the 7 swing states. When I use Ground News, I can see that exactly 61 articles have covered this story. Interestingly, 60% of the sources are right-leaning. Is it any wonder why the left isn't covering this story, right? You see, that's one of Ground News' best features. They cover the blind spots in the legacy media's reporting failures. So go to ground.news/Dr. Steve to check it out. Head over right now to subscribe through my link and get 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription. That's what I have. When you subscribe, you not only support our Turley Talks movement, but you also support an independent platform trying to make the news more transparent. Click on that link below right now. Tucker then asked Dugan what he thought the difference was between the modern left version of liberalism and the more classical form of liberalism, which has always been seen as a much-needed defense and defiance against tyranny.
Very interesting question. I think that is the problem is in two definitions of liberalism. There is old liberalism, classical liberalism,
yes,
and new liberalism. So classical liberalism was in favor of democracy. Democracy understood as the power of majority, of consensus, of individual freedom that should be combined somehow with the freedom of others. And now we have totally the next station already, next phase, new liberalism. Now it is not about the rule of majority, but it is about the rule of minorities. It is not about individual freedom, but it is about wokeism. So you should be so individualistic that you should criticize not only the state, but individual, the old understanding of individual. So you are invited to liberate yourself from individuality, to go further in that direction.
Now, for me, that was a golden answer. That was a goal because I have to admit, I never quite understood or made sense of how classical liberalism, the idea of the liberation of man from tyranny, could end up morphing into modern day liberalism, which is itself the very definition of tyranny. According to Dugan, the logical outworking of liberation from any collective identity and constraint works itself out in precisely that manner. After having liberated the individual from state power and church power, and increasingly family and community constraints, at some point, liberalism is going to want to liberate us from the individual itself. The individuality that was so important in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s is now seen as a new form of collective conformity and constraint. So identity politics is a logical outworking of liberalism that ironically ends up at war with the very conception of the individual that birthed liberalism in the first place. Absolutely fascinating. Finally, Tucker asked a question that many of us on this channel have asked before. Given the love affair the American left had with Russia during the Soviet period, I mean, Bernie Sanders actually honeymooned in the Soviet Union, right? Given that, Why does the American left so viscerally hate Russia, and particularly Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, now?
He is a kind of leader, political leader, defending traditional values. So only recently, 1 year ago, Putin has made a decree of the political defense of traditional values. That was turning point, I would say. But observers from the progressive camp in the West, I think they have understood that from the beginning of his rule correctly. So this hatred is not just casual, something casual or some mood. It is not.
It's not casual. It's very serious.
So it's metaphysical. So if your main task and main goal is to destroy traditional value, traditional family, traditional states, traditional relations, traditional beliefs, and someone on that with the nuclear weapon, that is not smallest, the least, but the last but not least argument. Someone with nuclear weapon to stand strong, defending traditional value, you are going to abolish. I think they have some basis for this Russophobia and the hatred for Putin.
Here I think Dugan is absolutely right. President Putin, whether you agree with him or not, has successfully and steadfastly stood up against liberal globalism in defense of traditional Christian values, often in a way that, frankly, American Christians who've been so softened by secular liberalism often can't quite understand. At the beginning of Putin's tenure in the year 2000, he began to implement measures involving Russia's, quote, spiritual security, which is considered a subset of national security in a number of policy documents issued by the Putin administration. The Russian government's focus on spiritual security is designed as a primary measure by which traditional Russian values, embodied particularly by the Russian Orthodox Church, can be protected and perpetuated in the midst of globalized assaults. And so, astonishingly, the Russian Federation's conception of national security actually includes protecting their nation's cultural, spiritual, and moral legacy, and the religious traditions and the standards of public and social life, all in an effort to reawaken the uniqueness of Russian culture in a revitalized civilization state. This alone has been enough to radically offend liberal sensibilities, which are dedicated to eradicating traditional religion all over the world. And Alexander Dugan basically pointed out, liberal globalists are quite right to be offended by Putin. He does indeed stand against everything they stand for. And as we know all too well, the last thing the modern left will ever tolerate is dissent and defiance. Altogether, I thought the Dugan interview was fascinating. It was a rather short interview, just over 20 minutes, and provided a very helpful précis of Dugan's profound insights and critiques of what's happening in the very clear breakdown and unraveling of Western society. The solution to our breakdown is clear. We need to reject liberalism and once again embrace nation, culture, custom, and tradition, the very hallmarks of civilization. Nothing less than our very humanity is at stake.